Welcome back, everybody. Joe Concha filling in for Steve Malzberg here on the Steve Malzberg Show. It is Tuesday here in New York, and a beautiful one, or at least it's become that, as we're heading towards 55 degrees by Friday, and with about a foot of snow on the ground. You can only imagine the potholes that will eventually be emerging from what has been easily the most horrific winter of my lifetime. And I probably say that because I bought a house this year, and having an apartment before everybody shoveled snow basically away from my sidewalk and my steps, now I'm responsible for all of it, and it's not agreeing with my 43-year-old back. So glad to see that spring may be finally kind of sort of on the horizon. Only what now, about 10 days left of February, and then once you're in March and it's March Madness, you know what, might as well just break out the bathing suit, or at least put away the jacket at that point. At least we're hoping for that here in New York. Anyway, speaking of the environment and speaking of the planet in general, Leighton Steward, the chairman of Plants Need C02. She's a leading scientist and environmentalist, joining me right now to talk about some interesting news out of Washington as far as the president ordering the EPA and the Department of Transportation to create and issue new fuel efficiency and greenhouse gas standards for trucks by the end of 2016. Leighton, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe. Happy to be here.
Sure. So what do you think about that today as far as the new efficiency standards? And particularly, this seems to be more aimed at trucks and truckers in general in terms of decreasing emissions 10, 20%. Good news, bad news? What's your take?
Well, it's bad news. Really what they've done is they've moved from some of these transportation vehicles and things that move around. Now they're going to put out new regulations for stationary sources. That's going to pick up power plants. It's going to obviously pick up coal plants. And what they're putting out here is essentially going to stop the development of any new coal plants. And as soon as they get that done, everybody figures they'll go ahead and move in and put these same regulations on existing coal plants and just put the coal people out of business. But this all fits in with exactly what President Obama said when he was running for president a few years ago. He said, I am going to bankrupt the coal industry and energy prices will necessarily skyrocket. He said that. It's on tape. It's public. So it looks to me like that he's just trying to follow through with that, and instead of going through the Congress or anything else that we all, people that we elected to represent us up there, he's going to do it just by executive fiat and tell the EPA to get it done. And it looks like that's where we're headed on that. The bad part about that's going to be that it's going to really raise the price of energy, which will affect everything, utility bills and food supplies and transportation and all of that. And it's going to hurt the poor people the most because they're the ones that don't have any optional dollars to spend. And you crank up somebody's utility bills at home every month when they're just barely living on the edge of the wire, and you have hurt them real badly. So we're hoping that that the Supreme Court has realized when they gave the EPA in 2007 the ability to call carbon dioxide a dangerous pollutant, that that has had impacts that they didn't really think about at the time. One thing carbon dioxide is not, and that is a pollutant. And I challenge anybody that's in your listening audience to come up with an example of carbon dioxide being a pollutant. You can't find any chemistry professor that can give you an example of that. It's absolutely necessary for all life on Earth. It makes our plants, food crops, trees grow like crazy as we raise the level of carbon dioxide. We all learned in the 3rd grade that CO2 is what plants eat, and it's just about that simple. If we want robust habitats, ecosystems, etc., we ought to be happy to see the CO2 level rising because it is helping the plant and animal kingdoms as that happens. And so the bottom line on all that is that the true environmentalists out there have been misled on this issue. And what I'm hopeful of and what we're seeing happen right now is that people are beginning to get a little skeptical about some of these pronouncements coming out of the administration because they've misled us on Benghazi, Obamacare, where the IRS problem really happened and things like that. And I think a lot of people are beginning to wonder, well, I wonder if we're being lied to about what is causing global warming, which, by the way, hasn't happened now for the last 16 years. The CO2 level's going up and the temperature is staying flat.
Well, I can tell you here in New York, at least, just if you ask anybody on the street, and again, these aren't scientists, but people say, my God, this has been one of the coldest winters ever, not just in New York, but across the country. Just a week ago, 49 of 50 states had snow on the ground in some capacity. Florida was the only one that did not. Does that say that the global warming isn't happening or is happening just based on one season? No, but this is not the time to make that argument for regular folks that just don't pay attention to this stuff very much. Right. So what are you, crazy? This has been a horrible winter. At Boston and Chicago today are whited out. It's a tough argument to make just based on what people feel and see every day. Leighton, you brought up, and we're talking with Leighton Steward. He's the chairman of Plants Need C02. You mentioned the Supreme Court before. When will arguments be heard in this, and what do you see ultimately as an outcome as far as whether carbon monoxide is actually seen as a pollutant or not?
Well, we're absolutely hopeful that the Supreme Court will say, no, Mr. Administration, you do not have the authority to go in and regulate stationary sources, such as these coal plants, because that was not in the original Clean Air Act. So that's what we're hoping they will say. We do not know what they'll say, so we're all just keeping our fingers crossed on that. But that would be a solution to this very quickly, because not that I'm saying coal's the best thing in the world or the worst thing in the world. Interesting thing is, it probably does put more CO2 in the atmosphere than any of the other energies that we're burning now to produce our electricity. So I guess if you really want to think about it, and from what we learned in the third grade, you'd say, well, gee, if the plants could vote, they might vote for coal. Because that's exactly what would happen. There have been over 5,300 studies by the agricultural communities worldwide that have done peer-reviewed studies that show the tremendous increase in growth from additional carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it's simply because we're feeding the plants more of what makes them grow. And so that is a no-brainer to really be able to figure out what's going to happen as we put more CO2 in the atmosphere. The only thing that scares people to death is they say, oh, yes, but it causes global warming. Well, I'm a geologist and was trained to look back and see what's happened in the Earth's past history to see why it's like it is today and why it may be different in the future. And that is totally applicable here. When you look back and see what the correlation has been between carbon dioxide and Earth's temperatures, whether we're talking about this last 16 years, last century, last millennia, last 10 million years, last 500 million years, we don't see a close correlation between carbon dioxide levels and Earth's temperature. And old Winston Churchill said, the farther backward you look, the farther forward you're likely to see. And unfortunately, our administration has the blinders on, and they've only been looking at temperature and CO2 levels since about 1975 or 80, when they happen to be both going up at the same time. But if you look back from the 1950s to the mid-70s, CO2 levels were going up, the temperature was going down. You probably remember when some of the major magazines said, hey, we're entering another glacial stage.
That's right, Time magazine.
You know, et cetera. And from 1910 to 1945, the temperature was going up equally as steep as it did in the 80s and 90s, and yet the CO2 level was hardly changing. So that's what I'm talking about. There's just not a good correlation there. People have been misled. The reason everybody's scared to death is there are a bunch of unvalidated, and I stress, unvalidated climate models that show predictions that Earth might warm catastrophically. Well, let me give you another website besides our own. Go to the Right Climate Stuff, the rightclimatestuff.com. It's a bunch of NASA scientists and astronauts that have been studying this for 2 years now, a lot of PhDs, astrophysicists, geophysicists, geochemists, etc., and they say we're not in any harmful future relative to the climate change because they don't see that CO2 is having any significant impact.
Well, Leighton, I'm a media guy first, and I can tell you that certainly the media has taken a side on global warming and present more as fact than as opinion, and don't seem to offer up your perspective enough. So we'll certainly encourage our viewers to go to rightclimatestuff.com. Unfortunately, Leighton, we are out of time.
Yeah, and go to plantsneedco2.org.
Oh, of course.
And you'll see some data behind what I'm saying.
Okay, well, that was going to be my tag out to you, that of course you have to visit plantsneedco2.com. Leighton Steward, thanks so much for joining us here in slightly warmer but perpetually cold for the last 4 months in New York. We certainly appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Joe.
Okay, Leighton. And we'll be back with more of the Steve Malzberg Show. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective, Rick Unger will be joining me live on set, and he better bring me a coffee and at least 3 waters. That is just one little request that we have here at Malzberg, Rick, okay? So you are now my intern. Back with more Steve Malzberg, Rick Unger, next.
The Steve Malzberg Show.